This is Linux in Laws, a podcast on topics around free and open source software, any associated contraband, communism, the revolution in general, and whatever else fancies your tickle. Please note that this and other episodes may contain strong language, offensive humor, and other certainly not politically correct language. You have been warned. Our parents insisted on this disclaimer. Happy, Mum? Thus, the content is not suitable for consumption in the workplace, especially when played back on a speaker in an open plan office or similar environments. Any minors under the age of 35, or any pets, including fluffy little killer bunnies, your trusted guide dog, unless on speed, and cute T-Rexes or other associated dinosaurs. Welcome to Linux and Laws, Season 1, Episode, what is it, Martin? 265,407, right?
Oh, I think we're in the millions now, aren't we?
Excellent. Martin, how are things over there in the melting kingdom?
Slightly melted, but yeah, still floating.
I reckon the summer has commenced early in the UK, as in the 3rd of August rather than the 15th of
The
August.
summer is actually still going. It's amazing. It normally is finished by June time, but yeah, we have actually some warm weather in August. It's the first, for sure.
Greta Thunberg, if you're listening,
yes.
in case you are, full marks, especially for the UK. Well done. Global warming all the way.
Yeah, what about yourself, anyway, Chris? How are things in?
It's in Frankfurt, slightly cooler. It checks in at about 35 degrees today, as in centigrade, not Fahrenheit. So that makes a cooling refresh from the smelting 40 that we had a couple of days ago.
Oh, nice. Yes. Okay, I think probably Ran can top all these temperatures, right? What have you got?
and exactly. So, without further ado, we should probably introduce our guest for tonight.
Indeed.
Martin, why don't you do the honors?
Sure. So, yeah, very pleased to say that we have Ran Levi on the podcast tonight. Obviously, a great podcaster himself with very famous guests on his podcast. Some very interesting for myself, and I think for you as well, Chris. Right? You actually introduced me to Malicious Life, so. Yeah, great podcaster, yes. Great show. Anybody who hasn't listened to it, go and listen to it because it's brilliant. If you're interested in cybersecurity, and then on top of that, Ran did a lot of podcasting for Curious Minds and is a distinguished engineer in electronics, if I'm not mistaken. But by all means, Ran, why don't you say a few words about yourself, if that's okay?
Hello. Hi. Thank you for having me on the show.
No, it's our pleasure.
Sure. And yes, I do relate to the hot temperatures, and we've got also humidity. So we've got double trouble, as they say. I've been a podcaster since 2007, which makes me rather old in podcasting terms. I started podcasting in Israel. I created a show in Hebrew called Making History, and luckily it took off. It's about history of science and technology, and it took off, and for a long time I was Israel's most successful and only podcaster. No, really. I mean, I had a great run for like 10 years. I was very well known in Israel. I'm still very well known in Israel in podcasting, except now there are lots more podcasts, so I'm not the top podcaster anymore, but that's a good thing. I mean, it's not fun being a big fish in an empty pool, so it's better to be with
a bit of competition, right?
Exactly. Competition is great. So about five, and as Martin I think said, I was also an electronics engineer and software developer for like 20 years. And due to the podcast's success, I left my day job, created a company, PI Media, a podcast production company. And we've got something like 40 to 50 podcasts, and most of them in Hebrew, some of them in English. And as you mentioned, there's Malicious Life. It's our most successful English podcast about the history of cybersecurity. It's a narrative podcast, and I think that it it was, I think it was number 10 on iTunes technology charts. That's the top spot that we got I think, few months back. So it's a great show, and I love it very much.
Well deserved, I might add.
Yes, yeah. Did you just say you had 40 to 50 podcasts with your company?
Yes, we've got something like that. I mean, it's a big team, of course. We've got 10 full-time employees in the company, and some more like 50 part-time and like temporary workers, freelance podcasters. And we're doing lots of stuff. I'm now the executive director, the executive editor, and also the host of several podcasts.
Wow, that sounds like a very busy job indeed. It's
yeah, but it's fun.
Given how much effort we spend on our podcast, yeah, for sure.
But it's
as you say, it's fun. Yeah, definitely. Sorry, Chris.
No worries. Just go ahead, Martin.
Alrighty. Yeah. So, I mean. Before we get into the kind of all the nitty-gritty about technology stuff, I think you didn't mention why you started the podcasting piece, being in a software engineer and stuff like that. It's kind of like one day, let's do a podcast, right?
No, actually, I got my start. I mean, I first learned about podcasts, I think it was back in 2005. And back then, I was big into digital photography. Digital cameras were just becoming a thing, and I bought my first digital camera, and I was looking for to learn the basics of photography. And there was a German podcast called Tips from the Top Floor. I don't know if it even exists today, but it was very popular back in 2005. I mean, we're talking about basically a year or two after podcasts were invented, basically. So it was very big, and I learned a lot.
A German podcast in German? Sorry.
No, it was in English.
It was okay, fair enough.
Yeah. But it was a German guy, Chris Marquardt, I think was his name, and he did a fantastic job. And I said to myself, I mean, this guy's a photographer, right? I mean, he's not a professional radio personality or whatever. But he is doing a great job teaching us about photography, and he does it from his studio. I mean, he doesn't have like a proper professional studio. So I said to myself, why not? Why not me? What's the difference? So I started I bought this basic microphone, just trying to see how things work. I've never been to a radio station before, so I had no idea what to do, but I learned how to edit, basic editing and stuff. It was pretty easy to learn because I'm basically proficient with computers. Plus I was already an established author back then. I wrote books about science and technology, so I had content and I knew how to write. So after about a year of trying all sorts of stuff, I created my first real podcast, and my expectation was that nobody will listen to it because nobody in Israel even knew what podcasting is. And I remind you, this is 2006, 2007.
Yeah.
We didn't even have smartphones then. I mean, I think the iPhone came about in 2007. So listening to podcasts back then was very difficult. You had to download the episode and transfer it to, what was it, these small MP3 players that we had back then. And it was very difficult to listen to podcasts. So I was fully prepared to have no listeners. But I said to myself, well, it's a fun try. But within 2 months, people started sending emails. This is a great show. We love it. Although when I listen to these early episodes, I don't understand why
you see a bit of progression from your current work there.
Yeah, it's horrible to listen to your first episode. I mean, it's so bad. But people really, they had no alternative. Nobody in Israel was doing anything like that. So it was very novel, very new. And it took off. And within like 2 years, I had a few thousand listeners. I think that in 4 years, I passed my first million total downloads. And then, things just took off. I mean, it's one of these stories where you don't really know what's happening. People are listening. People are, telling their friends about the show, but you have no control. And it became very difficult to be an engineer, by day and a podcaster by night. I don't understand those kind of, Batman movies where the hero, he has time to be a millionaire by day, and Batman, where does he sleep? I didn't sleep.
Probably from the ceiling, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The exact same problem that Martin and myself are facing too. Never mind the fact that Martin keeps firing marketing all over the place. But that's a separate topic.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, but it's been an amazing adventure. I mean, I never expected to do anything that significant in my life, and it's an amazing adventure. I mean, I fully expected to be, an engineer working, 9 to 5. So, like, it was a big surprise for me.
Okay, so I take it you also don't have any plans to take up something else like, I don't know, YouTubing or any sort of television-based that kind of scenario. You found your thing with podcasting, right?
I mean, podcasting is what I do now, but I don't consider myself to be a podcaster necessarily. I mean, I'm basically an author. I write. That's what I did ever since I was a young kid. And podcasting is great for writers because it allows me to bring my writing to life in an audio setting, which is much richer than text. I like audio. But if the opportunity presents itself, I would love to do video as well. If I have the opportunity to do something really significant in video, I'll be happy to. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's. Sorry, Chris. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Very interesting insight, Ran. Just curious. You already mentioned Curious Minds. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the origins of this podcast and how you came about open source in general and Curious Minds in particular, especially with regards to some of the focal areas of this podcast.
Yeah. So the open source aspect comes from the fact that I'm a big open source fan, have been for a long time. I mean, as a developer, I didn't have many opportunities to contribute to open source myself because most of what I was doing when I was a full-time engineer was more security stuff, which tends not to be available online most of the time. But I've been using Linux for years and using open source software whenever I can. Even my company uses solely Linux. We don't use Windows computers. So I'm a big oopen source fan.
Did you get rid of the JavaScript in the end?
No. Yeah, that's funny. That's funny because, as I said, my first podcast was making history about the history of technology. And at one point, I read an article about the history of open source, and I became very interested in how it came to be. And I said to myself, it should be very interesting to talk to Richard Stallman, who's like the pioneer of free software, because I mean, I was a big fan of Richard Stallman ever since I've heard about the man. He's he's the prototypical, the archetypical hacker, if you like. I mean, he's the early pioneer with the long gray hair and the beard, and somebody as a kid used to write software, but he didn't have computers, so he wrote it on paper. I mean, that guy was really hardcore engineering, and he was one of my heroes. So I said to myself, you know what? maybe that's a good opportunity to have him as a guest. And I did. I did an episode in the Hebrew podcast, and it was very well received. People liked it. And I think like 7 years ago, when I quit my day job as an engineer and started my own company, the basic idea of starting the company was to expand Making History to international audiences in English, because the topics I usually write about, science and technology, are universal in nature. They'll work in any culture in almost any time. So I had the notion that it could work, and I started Curious Minds. Did it for like 3 years, and it was successful. I mean, at the peak, we had something like 6,000, 7,000 listeners per episode, which is nice for like a podcast who is created by an Israeli non-English speaker, non-native English speaker. But really, for a company in the business sense, that's not enough, not nearly enough even. So after 3 or 4 years, I understood that my problem is not content, but marketing, because in English, there's lots and lots of content available from, in the US itself, there's like 2 million podcasts in iTunes directory. So, I mean, you've got great competition. Right. Yeah. So you need to really be good in marketing and have connections and the networking aspect. So I said to myself, you know what? I'll put the show on pause, and I'll do something else. And that's when Malicious Life came about, because we had Cybereason as the sponsor of the show, which allowed us to do good marketing at the beginning of the show and allowed it to grow. But when Curious Minds was active, I just took the Hebrew podcast the Hebrew episode that I did with Richard Stallman, and Tim O'Reilly also appeared in that podcast, yep. And converted it to English almost as is. I mean, it's just the content works in any language, basically. And it was a great experience to talk to the guy. I mean, in a sense, it was a disappointment. Because he was, as I said, my hero. I saw him as somebody who is...
Never meet your heroes, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I thought of him as somebody who is like, he breathes and he's neck deep in technology 24/7, like myself, basically. But while I was speaking to him, I learned that because of some reason that maybe we'll get to later, he almost doesn't use technology nowadays. I mean, as an example, when I was communicating with him over email, trying to set up the interview, he was very determined that we shouldn't use JavaScript on the website where the episode will be posted, and the episode shouldn't be on an MP3 file, but on an OGG file, which is an open source format. And I said to him, Richard, sorry, but if I remove JavaScript from the website, the website won't work. And nobody knows how to play OGG files. I mean, everybody uses MP3. So he kind of, he relented a bit. I mean, he allowed me to use JavaScript because he doesn't like new technology because it's mostly proprietary. He doesn't like proprietary software. And MP3 was proprietary also. So he doesn't use modern technology. He doesn't have a phone. He doesn't use the basic stuff that most people use every day.
Sorry, Ran, just sorry for interrupting here, but that's exactly my experience. A few years back, I tried to get an interview out of him for a German open source magazine, online magazine, I might add. And we discussed the interview for almost half a year via email. And he went as far as saying, sorry, JPEG for the website where this e-magazine would appear is not an option. You have to use PNG. And that sort of shenanigans. Ran, given the recent history of somebody called Richard M. Stallman, care to shed more light on your view here. Full disclosure: we had the chairman of the. I hope I'm doing Matthias justice here. We had the chairman of the Free Software Foundation Europe on the show about what, Martin? About a year ago, maybe 1.5 years ago.
Yeah.
And the FSFE tried and succeeded also, I might add, to distance itself somewhat from the FSF in the light of the fallout of this bot shenanigans slash story, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, the FSFE wasn't too happy with RMS rejoining the board. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments on this. Needless to say, you can keep it kind of PC if you want to, but bear in mind, this podcast is explicit, so by all means, max yourself out.
Well, I mean, I really don't know anything about the accusations that were levied against him as part of the Me Too movement. I mean, that's the basic thing. But I suspect that the real underlying reason that the FSF is trying to distance himself from Richard Stallman is because, as you said, I mean, he is a difficult man. He is an idealist in the purest way, the purest term. He doesn't give up even an inch on his ideals, and he's very difficult to work with. But after talking to him and actually reading about his views and about what he says, I think that there's lots of truth in what he's saying. And maybe, he's one of these guys who is willing to suffer for what he believes, even if everybody else kind of ridicules him and try to distance themselves from him. It's not an easy thing to be, the lonely voice inside of an organization, trying to get everybody to do, quote unquote, the right thing. And we should say that the right thing for Richard Stallman is to only use free software, not open source software. He doesn't believe in open source. He doesn't like open source. He specifically asked me never to say that he is the father of the open source movement, although he is, in a sense. He doesn't like it. He really thinks, he really thinks that software should be free in the very, very, not in the, the monetary sense, not free of charge, but free as in freedom, in the freedom to change whatever you like, to copy the software, to modify it, whatever you like. And every other form of software is considered by him to be really even evil. I mean, he sees the world in black and white. And
that's exactly it.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? I can talk about, places where you can see that he's basically right. He always says that, why doesn't he like open source software? Because he says that open source, because it allows companies to use open source, and they don't have to make it completely free. They don't have to make it modifiable and change their subtle differences in terms of the legal terms here. But because they are not committed to software being free, then the problem is that when open source stops becoming good for a company in terms of its revenue, when it stops to being favorable in a sense, they immediately leave open source and go the proprietary way. A good example for that is Google and Android. I don't know if most of our listeners are aware, but Android started out as a product created by a company named Android back then, and Google bought it and made it open source, which is great, right? giving the world an open source software, open source operating system, which is fantastic. But that was in the beginning when Google was trying to fight Apple for control on the mobile phone market, and they needed a good operating system. When Android surpassed the iPhone, and now there are many more Android phones than iPhones, Google discovered that having Android open source is actually bad for business, because now Samsung or Amazon can take Android and make their own phones, and of course Google doesn't want that competition. In fact, that's what Amazon did with its Amazon Fire phone or tablets, and of course Google doesn't want that. So what it did, and it can't go back from Android being open source. So what it did was kind of strangle the open source version of Android, and not update any of the applications that come with Android, like the phone, the calendar, the search app, all sorts of applications like these. And that meant that after 3-4 years of nobody updating these programs, people had no choice but to use Google's version of Android, which is proprietary. So the so what Stallman says is that open source was just good for Google, and while it was good, Google used it. But once it was bad for Google, it had no problem, getting rid of the open source and taking the software back to being basically proprietary. And he's right in a sense. Yeah, that's nobody will go back to Android open source because that software is no longer relevant in our world. But he's right. They stopped updating the open source software. So he's a difficult man, but he's got good points.
At the end of the day, you bring up a very interesting aspect, because at the very end of the day, the Android operating system boils down, as a foundation, has something called a Linux kernel, which is, as a matter of fact, GPL licensed. So anybody touching the kernel running on an Android device, because of the licensing restrictions, and of course GPL is a valid license, for the two listeners in the audience not knowing what GPL is, GNU Public License, I will put a link into the show notes where we, as Martin and myself, talk about open source licensing. If you cannot get to sleep at night, that's probably the episode you want to listen to. Anyway, going back to the licensing, the thing is that the Android ecosystem below the Dalvik or the Android runtime, as in the stuff basically that executes the Java or Kotlin code bases that the proprietary ecosystem is made up of. The kernel and the libc equivalent called Android Open Source Project AOSP is still GPL licensed. So whoever touches this has to publish the changes. Hence this notion of Google to publish something called FuckShare, which essentially is a BSD license, I think, or some other permissive license anyway, replacement ultimately for Android. Because being that permissive license, they can do pretty much whatever they want with it. If they basically simply attribute the ecosystem to the original creator, namely Google. So that's a very interesting move going forward. Basically, Andrew Rubinstein, who originally invented the Android ecosystem, essentially just chose Linux because it was freely available. Given the fact that Linux is probably the operating system that is, how can I put this, most widely used on this planet with regards to from small embedded devices, and mobile phones probably are even above this level, right up to mainframes. It's probably fair to say that Linux is the most widely deployed operating system on the planet. But this is just basically on the Android angle, and that's a very interesting fact, given the fact that we are looking at a history of about 10 plus years now for Android phones. But you're spot on with regards to Richard himself, because if it was for him, the operating system would be called GNU, and in tiny letters /Linux. So you
Indeed.
cannot talk about Linux. You have to talk about GNU/Linux. That's important.
And what is interesting as well is that I think that the addition of adding Linux to the GNU project was actually, I think, what started the chain of events that ended up with the creation of open source. Because we're talking here about the early 1990s. The Free Software Foundation was working on GNU, the GNU operating system. They had a kernel which was called Herd.
Herd, yes.
But it wasn't good enough. It was too complicated and it wasn't stable enough.
Yeah, Ran, it still isn't.
It still isn't.
The long-term project.
That must be some kind of record. Some kind of record here. But they had great difficulties, and they were aware that without an operating system, the Free Software Foundation, nobody will actually take part in the movement. So at stroke of luck, Linus Torvalds published Linux in 1991, the very first versions. And it took some time for Richard Stallman to acknowledge it, but he within a few years, he understood that Linux is the future. And he, as you said, he incorporated into the GNU operating system, calling it GNU/Linux. But the problem is that Linus was a celebrity. Everybody knew him, and he was very much admired by the free software community. He didn't share these free software values that Richard Stallman had. And there's a very interesting incident where there was a kind of a conference where Linus gave, the keynote speech, and he was using Microsoft's PowerPoint. And as our listeners,
oh dear.
Exactly, as our listeners can probably understand, placing PowerPoint in front of Richard Stallman is like waving a red blanket in front of a raging bull. He hates Microsoft. He hates PowerPoint. And there was a big argument. Is Linus right in using a proprietary software where he should be using only free software? And Linus plainly said, I don't care. It's a proprietary software, but it's a good presentation software. I want to use it. So that kind of set, the events in motion where the whole community started drifting more to Linus's way of thought. That, we all love free software. We want it to be free. But if there's a good proprietary software, why not use it? And of course, Stallman very much didn't agree. So after about 6 or 7 years, it became really clear that as long as Richard Stallman has his hands on the wheel, free software will not be a successful movement because he is very, very extreme. He's an extremist in his view. He's an idealist. And really, he thinks about the world in terms of, a class struggle, like Karl Marx, in a sense. So in 1998, few people came together in the free software movement, and they said, okay, we need to change things, else the business world will not take part in this movement. If the businesses cannot live in an ideal world, they need to be pragmatic, practical. They need software that they can use and sometimes be proprietary if they need it to be. So they started the open source initiative, and of course this made Stallman very angry, but there was nothing to do. It was a separate movement, and it over time it of course took off, and now it is the dominant force in the free software world. And Free Software Foundation is still relevant, but it's not as influential as Richard probably would have loved to, which is sad, but I think that's the way the world works, right?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on because, I mean, you mentioned the Google example, right, and Android, and this is why Richard Stallman doesn't like the open source software or that kind of. He likes the free software, freedom of software rules that he's kind of adheres to. But if you follow those rules, or if you look at them closely, there is a lot in there about that. Everybody is free to use, copy, sell software, right? So in a way, it's a little bit of a, let's say, breaking his own rules by condemning Google for doing what they did with Android. Would you agree on that? Or?
I mean, I think that what really bothers him is that Google and other companies who use open source when they need to, they don't really believe in the values of free software. They don't promise their customers or their the people around them that they'll keep their software always free, always modifiable, always you can copy everything. They are kind of opportunists. If open software is good, then it's good. If not, we'll leave it. And Stallman think that's wrong. You should really believe in software being free. And if you're not a believer, then you're not good enough for Stallman. That's kind of the extremist view.
Hence the hatred, I'm almost tempted to say, between the BSDs of the world and the GNUs, because if you take a look at the BSD, and Isenberger software distribution, also a very famous or popular operating system, nowhere near or nowhere close to Linux, of course, but we had them on the podcast about, Martin, a year, maybe 1.5 years ago, a couple of the current maintainers, and they have a very different view of the world in terms of software licensing has to be permissive. Just simply take the code and do whatever you want with it, bar a few restrictions, for example, attribution. Whereas Richard M. Stallman is under the kind of, I'm almost tempted to say, Stalinist, Leninist, whatever you want to call it, view that every piece you touch, you have to publish the changes, full stop. So you simply cannot take the source code and do whatever you want to do with it. No, you have to give it back to the public.
Exactly.
And that's a very difference between permissive licenses and the more viral license approaches of the world, like the GPL family of licenses.
Yeah, and I think that's the tragedy of Richard Stallman, because I really believe that his ideas are good. I really think that if his way of thinking will be, rule the world, then we will all be much better off. The problem is that him being so idealist and so extremist kind of prevents that kind of idealistic, utopian, world from existing. Yeah. But now that we have open source, which is a bit more pragmatic, open source is taking over the world. I mean, everybody uses open source. Big companies contribute to open source. It is an amazing revolution. And it started because of Richard Stallman. But tragically, he was the one thing that almost stopped that revolution from happening. That's really tragic.
And a few other people, of course. Richard Stallman probably was the iconic figure, but Eric Raymond and some other people also helped along the way. I'm tempted to say, fair enough.
Of course,
but he's probably the flag post. Let's put it this way. But unfortunately, I concur with you, Ran, that I wouldn't say he's falling by the wayside, but eventually, some other, I'm almost going to say folks will take over, but folks probably the word, but rather ideals or maybe ideas as in general will prevail. Maybe RMS has run its course, not with regards to the core ideas, because the core ideas and everything that the FSFF still stands for, but maybe a more liberal / permissive approach is now the order of the day.
Probably, yeah.
I mean, the ideals that he applies to software, you could apply to other products as well, right? It's. I mean, if you are I don't know, let's say buying a cooking pan, you don't get the design for the pan with it, right? You don't get the details of how to make it. You get the end product. So that's kind of you could take that whole idealism quite a lot of a big step further. Right?
Now that we have 3D printing, I think that we're heading towards exactly that kind of revolution. I mean, it's already there. I mean, we see people, copying Lego designs, for example.
Yeah.
And people printing stuff that they want. I mean, if you have like a missing Lego piece and you print it and you can use it with your existing set. That's doing exactly, that's doing to proprietary hardware what open source and free software did to software back in the 80s and 90s. That's a big revolution. We're just starting to see it. But I mean, I've got here on my table, I've got an Arduino device, like the small microcomputers. And they're both amazing in terms of their capabilities. But what is more amazing is that because the design is open source hardware, you've got tens and hundreds of different manufacturers designing compatible boards or shields, as they are called. And like there's a whole hardware ecosystem, which I think if it wasn't open source hardware, would never have been created, because it's a very cheap device, and I don't think people maybe had like the financial motivation to create such a big ecosystem for sensors that cost like $1. Only because it's open source, I think it could have come about. And with 3D printing becoming what it is, I think we're headed for an amazing revolution in the years to come.
Interesting idea. Yeah. I mean, to me, it's sort of listening to what you were saying around Arduinos, and that kind of confirms the let's say the argument that open software or even open hardware, in case of Arduino, is for a very select public, right? It's the people that are interested in these kind of how things work. Let's put it that way, right? So whether it's an Arduino, or whether it's a mobile phone, or it's an operating system, but then the majority of people obviously are just there they're happy to use their phones, right? They don't want to know what runs underneath. They just want it to work and all the kind of stuff. That's the reality of where, and I guess. Yes,
but it drives innovation. It drives innovation, like we've seen in software as well. When you've got 1 million developers working on different softwares, then you've got lots of great ideas, people doing stuff like in various ways, and the best way wins. When it's proprietary, you only got one Windows, basically. I mean, you've got other operating systems, but nobody will create a new operating system from scratch to try and have some competition with Microsoft, because it's very difficult.
Yeah. Unless
you've got 1 million developers, each contributing a small part. And here we have Linux, which is a great competition for Microsoft, for Windows. And I think the same will happen with hardware, with proprietary hardware, be it Legos or Arduino. You'll have lots of ideas, lots of interesting, perspectives on how to do new things. And when something catches on, then, business companies will take that and run with it and bring good quality products to the general public. I think open source, the greatness of open source is it's the innovation in open source, not specifically, one better software or less good software. It's the innovation, it's the ideas that millions and millions of developers are like injecting into these programs.
And then for that to happen, and first of all, the program has to be transparent and visible, and as you say,
Exactly.
The more you can dive into something, then people can add their individual knowledge or flavor to it to make it better. To make so in a way, it's part of the let's say the history of the internet in a way of the way we deal with knowledge these days. Would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, we've got projects like Wikipedia, for example. I mean, who would have imagined that such a project could take place? Like, I mean, 30 years ago, you had people thinking about the idea of Encyclopedia Galactica, the kind of
yes.
an encyclopedia of everything.
A row of books on your bookshelf. Yes.
and by the way, I mean, I think YouTube is a great example of the problem with proprietary software. YouTube, I think, is one of the most important technological achievements of the modern age. I mean, all of human knowledge is in YouTube. In very really, I mean, there's nothing you want to learn on this planet that you can't learn by watching YouTube videos. Really, I mean, whatever I want.
Yeah.
Cooking to how to create a nuclear bomb. I haven't heard, but I'm
okay. I haven't done that one either.
Probably some Indian guy, right? I mean, somebody has to explain it.
So Mossad Unit 8200 publishes on YouTube as well. I'm just wondering. Maybe not.
I can't approve. I mean, I can't confirm or deny, as they say.
Fair enough.
Possibly comment.
Yeah, sorry, Mossad, if you're listening, the email address is feedback@linuxinlaws.eu. If you send us the link, we will put it in the show notes. No worries, and looking forward to it. Sorry, Ran. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, if the NSA is listening, I think it's good. We have a backup for the recording,
yes,
right? I mean,
yes.
You can ask for a backup if there's something wrong. But the point that I was getting to is that, I mean, YouTube is amazing. It's one of the greatest achievements. Yet, it will only stay alive while Google is alive. Well, I mean, like every company, Google will one day meet its demise. Someday, Google will be no more. Every company has an end. And when it does, we don't have these videos around that we can back up and maybe, distributed them across different places around the world.
Certainly need a lot of storage, that's for sure. We wanted to copy.
But that's a technical problem that can be solved if we need to, right? I mean, we did things like Bitcoin, for example. So it's possible. But as long as it's proprietary, if something happens to Google and Google crashes and is disassembled, we are losing one of them. It will be like the loss of the Library of Alexandria 2,000 years ago. It will be a real loss for humanity, I think. And I'm very worried that one day we'll lose this treasure because it's not open for the public. It will be very bad.
Interesting one. I mean, yes, you can download videos through various means, but that's probably not a topic for this one. But there's probably some rules and regulations or laws not to do these things. The only thing about, I guess, I agree with you completely. Right, is that YouTube is a great platform for finding any content or sharing knowledge. The only thing I think, it's not its predominant use, and you don't have that, as you say, for the innovation, that kind of discussion forum to improve the content. It tends to be more that that one or two guys post a piece of content, and then you get a bunch of fairly pointless comments underneath, and that's it, right? Rather than a discussion around you could do this better or different, or what I mean.
Yeah, it reminds me, by the way, of, if you want to hear a funny story, when I was just starting as a podcaster and the podcast was starting to take off and everything, and they invited me, one of the biggest websites in Israel back then invited me to write an article about one thing or another. I don't remember, but it was a big, important website, and it was, a big break for me as a creator. So I wrote the article, and it was posted on the main page, the front page of the website, and there were lots of people reading it and lots of comments. And I think the first or second comment was somebody writing, sorry, I haven't read the article, but maybe somebody has the recipe for onion jam, how to make jam with an onion. Something completely unrelated to the article, completely unrelated. And from that moment on, all the comments in the comment section were either people telling the first commentator that he's an idiot because this is not the place to ask for a recipe for an onion jam, or people giving great recipes for onion jams. So everybody forgot about me, in essence. I was reminded because you said that YouTube comments are chaotic most of the time. That's really it works.
I think. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there is some kind of sport out there as well, right? Just get the first comment in on whatever thing is published. That seems to be some kind of activity that young people do.
Ran, changing tack just a little bit. We can give the fact that we probably now have one of the most famous IT security podcasters of the planet on the podcast ourselves. Maybe we should spend 2 minutes on something called Malicious Life. For those people who do not know what Malicious Life is, maybe you can. I mean, you already touched about the format a little bit, but what I'm equally interested in is actually how do you see open source software? I'm not just talking about Metasploit or some other stuff, helping the IT security industry in general, and what difference open source, especially from a security perspective, makes in that realm.
That's a very difficult question. There have been lots.
I'm not known to ask the easy questions. Martin, this is Martin's game.
I take it easy with the guests. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there were many cases where open source software did have vulnerabilities in it, there were even big, were very well known applications like Instagram and others, which suffered because of vulnerabilities discovered in components that were open source. So you can't really say that making a software open source is a real solution for all the problems of cybersecurity in a sense. But I think it is part of the solution, because the software world is now becoming so connected. Take for example a big story that came out last year, SolarWinds. I don't know if all your listeners know the story. So the basic idea of the story was that there was one company called SolarWinds, which creates network management software, and it has thousands upon thousands of clients from the biggest companies on earth. And somehow, I think it was either Chinese or Russian hackers, I don't remember which, somehow managed to infiltrate the software repositories, and they modified the software, SolarWinds software, to include backdoors and other such malware, which infected thousands of companies, which was a very big deal, including the U.S. government and other governments. So, could that attack be discovered if SolarWinds software was open source? Probably. I mean, if you have lots and lots of people, taking a look at a software, checking it, making sure that it's fine, there is a good chance that this kind of attack could have been prevented. And because it was proprietary, nobody had the opportunity to look at it. And so the attack went on for almost a full year before it was discovered. So we've got both sides of the coin here. Making software open source is not one solution for every problem. You need proprietary software sometimes for certain aspects, because, say, for example, Google as a company its software is very secure. I haven't ever heard about somebody hacking into Google. If it was completely transparent, maybe, evil hackers, black hat hackers, could have taken a look into Google's software, find problems, and exploit them. But because the software is hidden, it is proprietary, nobody knows what Google is doing behind the scenes. Nobody can also exploit its software if it's doing a good enough job, which it does, probably. So open source, I think, is a big issue, but I don't see it becoming a central issue when it comes to cybersecurity. It's not a real solution. Cybersecurity is a very tough problem to solve. I personally think it will never be solved. As long as we have software, we'll have malware as well, probably. Like we have, biological viruses will always be present when there are cells around to infect. So malware will always exist. But it can be part of the solution if you implement it right within your organization. Probably.
It's a good way to look at it. We clearly like the argument that there are many people looking at a piece of software to be able to find vulnerabilities, as you say. But then I think, as you explained, on the flip side of the coin is that, and the other thing that we, as if we had on the podcast, various obviously open source projects, and a lot of them are, the smaller ones are struggling, right? They don't have big backing and are doing it with a couple of people in the evening, so therefore almost they cannot spend enough time and resources to secure everything they need to, right? But that's not to say that the bigger ones aren't able to do this. But yeah, there is an argument, as you say, to not disclose all the contents. It makes it harder to find vulnerabilities.
Yeah, we usually don't like security by obscurity. I mean, obscuring stuff. It usually doesn't work. But in certain cases, there are advantages to obscurity. You can't say that it never works. So this entire, I think, episode revolves around pragmatism in a sense. So we'll probably have to be a bit pragmatic in this aspect as well.
No, that's very true. Yes, we can all be idealists, but we all have to also kind of live in the world that we have, right? It's as you mentioned, like Richard Fine, he doesn't use phones and because of his ideals, and that is a choice that we could all make, but not many people do. I guess it's the. Okay, fair enough. Yeah. So you use PowerPoint as well, then? Or?
Yeah, I mean, me without technology, I wouldn't survive a day.
Nice.
I'm hooked, totally hooked.
I think that goes for all of us. But that's been more than great. It's as we mentioned at the start, we're great fans of your work, and we are among the many people that are great fans of your work. I think
Indeed.
you've got many listeners.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be able to create something that people from all over the world enjoy. I mean,
no, absolutely.
I'm talking to people from Norway, from India, from Australia, of course, from the US. And it's amazing. I mean, I really feel how the internet kind of brings us together. For me, it's a daily thing, which it's amazing feeling, I think.
Very
okay,
nice.
That has been very insightful. It's a long-standing tradition, Ran, that as part of wrapping this up, we do something called the Poxies. The Poxies are essentially the picks of the week, meaning something worth mentioning that you have come across over the last week or two, worth mentioning as part of the podcast. Martin normally does new cryptocurrencies. I normally do movies. But needless to say, the guests do anything from books. Yeah, books are also kind of favorites. But just anything goes. So without further ado, Ran, what's your POX?
Okay, so I mentioned how much I love YouTube. So I'll choose a channel called A Journey to the Microcosmos, and it's a channel about microscopy. I'm very much into microbiology. I'm a big fan of microbiology. And this channel has great videos taken from microscopes, various kinds of microscopes, taking a look at very amazing creatures that most of us are never aware even that exist. Plus, there's great narration, about what these creatures do, what they are composed of, their lives and stuff. And I mean, if one of our listeners is like into the tiny micro world, that's one channel you cannot miss. A Journey to the Microcosmos.
Links in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, links will be in the show notes. Yes, Martin, what's your POX? Thank you very much, Ran. Martin, what's your POX?
Well, I mean, this is not because Ran's on the podcast. We're discussing with Ran the topics for today's podcast. He mentioned obviously the episodes that he did with Richard Stallman and Tim O'Reilly, and I didn't know about Curious Minds before that. So then I started listening to Curious Minds, which was. That was my new after having almost finished not quite a Malicious Life. That's the next one I'm listening to with great interest.
I actually have two POXes. Yes, indeed. One of them, of course.
You got too much free time these days, haven't you? I think.
I wish that was the case. No, one of them is obviously Malicious Minds, and yes, links will be in the show notes.
Malicious Minds, I like that one. The new podcast is being born.
Sorry, Malicious Life. Sorry, my mistake. As in one of them. Yes, I've been listening to the show for at least 4 years, if not longer. And never mind the hate mail we're going to get, full marks for that work, because it's one of the most amazing IT security podcasts. Maybe Darknet Diaries come close, but as I said, Malicious Life for me is one of the must listen to podcasts. Second POX that I have, you're welcome. And this is my opinion. I'm not trying to brown nose here anything, but this is just me talking. As a matter of fact, Malicious Life was probably one of the original podcasts that introduced me to IT security way back. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, the second POX is a recipe how to make prune plum jam that I've come across recently again. This is serious, guys. This is a recipe.
Does it involve any onions or not?
No, it doesn't. Not funny enough. No, it's one of the great great recipes of my great grandmother that I unearthed about a month ago, when we kind of went through her scribblings in a handwritten recipe book. Needless to say, my great-grandmother is long gone, but the recipe still lives on. Details maybe in the show notes. Essentially, it boils down to doing it without a method that is prone to burning the plums. The way you do it essentially is you soak the plums in a mixture of sugar and vinegar for a night, and then you let it simmer for about 6 to 8 hours on low heat, and then you stir it for a bit, and then you have a plum marmalade that is second to none. The
Sounds easy to make. Yeah,
it just takes time, exactly, like every good food. Ran, it has been an absolute pleasure to having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Looking forward to having you back in a few years' time when the next podcast that you'll launch in about 2 months' time, if our flux compensator is anything to go by, flux capacitor as it's called.
It's Malicious Minds, isn't it?
Exactly. Malicious Minds, exactly. We'll have conquered the world once again.
This is the Linux in-laws.
You come for the knowledge.
But stay for the madness.
Thank you for listening.
This podcast is licensed under the latest version of the Creative Commons license, type Attribution Share Alike. Credits for the intro music go to Blue Sea Roosters for their song Solid Market, to Twin Flames for their piece called The Flow, used for the segment intros, and finally to Celestial Ground for their song Sweet Justice, used by the Dark Side. You find these and other ditties licensed under CC at Jamendo, a website dedicated to liberate the music industry from choking copyright legislation and other crap concepts.
Mr. Visser.
Richard, how are you doing?
Not so bad, and yourself.
How are we back, or are we left the FSF again, or what are we doing?
I can't really comment on that without my lawyer being present.
Lawyer, surely.
Yes.
Surely Richard doesn't employ lawyers. That doesn't. What about yourself? What's your time commitment?
I think you scared him away.
I did, yes.
Martin, I told you numerous times not to do this.
Come back. We need you, yes.